when we should not be doing assessments and how to do them correctly. And actually, like I mentioned a few weeks ago, a client that I was working with, we were going through the standard recruitment process, and there was a director position that they had open, kind of in the marketing, art, creative realm. And they decided after the second round of interviews that they wanted to apply an assessment. For a little bit more context, there were two people that were in the pipeline and they wanted to apply it to one person, not to both. And Summer, I remember talking to you about this. So we'll definitely walk through a bunch of these things as we kind of pummel through this. But actually, the candidate ended up declining the offer after going through all of this. But I definitely wanted to discuss, when assessments are appropriate, how this impacts the talent acquisition process, how we really need to set not only the recruiters up for success, but how we need to set up the hiring team up for success. And that way, when we are chatting with candidates, I like to set them up for success as well, of playing like, hey, here's what the process looks like. That way we're not saying, hey, here's another call. Hey, here's another call. Oh, by the way, there's an assessment. I want to make sure like I'm very upfront with them right away of their expectations. That way they can also know in the market what they can expect, especially coming from a small business or working with a consultant like me who is supporting a small business. So I definitely want to know from your perspective, Summer, in this case, what were your compliance concerns, pros and cons, stuff like that of assessments? Because I have my perspective of this specific situation, but I definitely want to know yours.
Well, I'm thrilled that you selected this because I feel like with your focus being on the talent acquisition side, and I spend more of my time personally with clients on the main HR consulting and compliance side, that we likely have different parts of this that we support, don't support, and I think it's important to kind of talk through those because certainly there are many different ways that companies can design their recruiting process, and I think that there's just a lot of factors that need to be weighed in determining like what works best for them. But heading into kind of the talent acquisition space over the past few years, we had to make a shift, right? We had to change the way that we were doing things in order to be able to compete. Now we see now that some of those changes that were made perhaps at that point in time were the right decision, but we're seeing the effects of it. And I think during that period of time where there was, this real emphasis, and I still think there is to a large degree, this emphasis in terms of like speed to hire, that we know any additional process or step or interview reduces the likelihood of being able to secure that individual as a hire. Are you still seeing that?
Yes, absolutely.
And so when we talk about having assessments, I think that it largely is, whether you should do them or not do them, it's going to depend on the company and the position, but there's so many more considerations. So just kind of my thoughts on this, the type of assessments that may be provided during the recruiting process would be what I would call a sample project. So if you think about, say, like a computer engineer, that may be a position where you give some parameters and what the deliverable is, and you expect this individual to provide you a sample of their work given those parameters, and it would allow you to evaluate that individual's skills and competencies that you would not otherwise without asking them for a sample project. So that's one. Then there's also personality assessments. Those, I think more individuals are familiar with how they work, but there's also risk assessments. And so, that may be a series of questions that team members are asked. And, essentially, given the example of a problem and the options that are provided, are they selecting options that when translated to results, essentially say that this individual is not a good decision maker and is posing could pose a potential risk to your organization. So certainly those are just a couple of different types of assessments that some companies provide. There's, I'm certain, a whole other host. So I think organizations need to be really asking themselves, can we afford to potentially lose candidates in this process? Is this assessment that important? And they also need to evaluate if they are compliant. Should they choose to proceed with those assessments? So, Devin, do you think that, prior to having our support and counsel in navigating these processes, that companies are really thinking through and asking those questions? Or are they just thinking, well, we need to know this, we're going to give an assessment, and not really weighing out the disadvantages in doing it?
I definitely don't think they're thinking through any compliance concerns. I definitely think they want to see if the work is going to show itself outside of just seeing a portfolio or just seeing any kind of designs or stuff like that, especially in like that marketing space or like the engineering space, because just a lot of that stuff can be mocked up or you can't see the full process flow, to where like a screen can be recorded, stuff like that. And they're not taking into consideration any of those concerns or any ADA things that they need to be aware of. And above all else, in the recruiting world, if we're not making them aware of like, okay, we're going to do the step one is going to be interview one with the hiring manager. Step two is going to be, with the CEO. And then step three will be the assessment. And this is what the assessment will look like, XYZ. Do you have any concerns with that? But if we're just going to throw an assessment at them and say, hey, we need you to complete this assessment as like the final round of your interview, then that's when we get some of these concerns. And that is what we came across with this candidate in particular. And now we come across some compliance concerns as well, which now we have come to talk through these things, which is now why it's on Consultants Corner.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious to know, I mean, do you have a preference one way or the other, or kind of what's your take on assessments in the process now, and like how are you navigating that with clients?
I would definitely say if we're going to do assessments, I definitely would need to know some context. I need to know how long it's going to take. I need to kind of know in the pipeline where we're going to have them. I would like to have them almost right after the first interview, just so we're not kind of waiting. One, not wasting the candidate's time, and then not wasting our time all the way through the interview process. And if it's really, really necessary. Like engineering roles, very specific roles to where like we really need them to do these things like you're mentioning earlier, then yes, by all means, we need to make sure we have credentialed assessments, that they're confirmed. Like we're not just like creating these assessments and just sending them off on their merry way. We just need to make sure like everybody along the process is aware, and that like through and throughout the talent acquisition process, everybody is aware of like the expectation. But just due to the speed, sometimes it might not be necessary, or just like the level of the candidate, or the position in general. So I definitely say it would depend, but we definitely do need to guide our people in the correct direction and kind of gear every conversation the correct way based on the position. So for this position in particular, the one that I had an issue with, I guess, for Consultants Corner, I definitely would not have done an assessment in this case. It wasn't a role that required an assessment by any means. A portfolio would have done more than enough. If anything, a walkthrough of the portfolio, like a storytelling, would have been more than enough. Especially they were already doing hour-long interviews with the hiring manager and the hiring manager with basically a roundtable. I think that would have been more than enough to explain the creative process of the designs. That was more of my take there based on their job description. So that was kind of the bottleneck there.
So what I'm hearing is that you're not saying no across the board to assessments, but rather there's kind of a time and a place, and that we need to really evaluate each position and company and needs on a case by case basis to determine whether the advantages that may be obtained are worth the risk. And we know that the risk is um, either minimizing the candidate pool or having otherwise qualified candidates that may be hired without the assessment eliminated from the process. And certainly that's a big risk. I'm curious, Devin, and then I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about compliance before we run out of time today. But have you encountered situations where you tell a candidate that there's an assessment in the process and then they're no longer interested?
Yes, I've actually had a few in this process in specific, to where I did let them know, because there were 3 other candidates that they were considering, and they let me know, like, for the ones that we were also considering later, that, "Hey, we're also going to implement assessments along the way." And I let them know what kind of assessment, how long it was going to take, and they said, "Oh, well, the other companies that I'm considering at the time, they're actually not including assessments. I'm actually further down the pipeline with them. I actually have an offer on the way. I'm actually no longer can I consider XYZ company." So that was kind of hands off arms length at that point. And unfortunately, that is the market of some of the options that they are weighing when they're looking into organizations, is how much work are they going to put through during the hiring or interview process for a role. And that's something you're just going to have to consider when you're looking for a candidate.
Yeah, it's super tough because I think, I've been on both sides of that debate about, well, if somebody is the right candidate, then they will be a candidate that will put in the additional work to complete the assessment. And so I definitely understand that. But I also see the other side of it, which is like that was 2+ years ago that we could be that way. But now with so many options, employees are finding just as good or better offers that don't have to go through that extra step. And I don't think that that's an indication of them not being the type of worker that you want to hire. I just think that there's barriers being removed to them being employed in other companies. And so we really need to evaluate whether that is the right thing. Now, from the employer's perspective, I know that what they're saying is, well, we just don't, we don't want to spend time hiring and onboarding somebody who is not going to be able to do the job. I totally get it. But there's also trust that you have to have in your hiring process. And if you have a solid hiring and interview process, then you should be able to answer those questions in most cases without an assessment.